The cold of the linoleum floor seeped through Helen's thin jeans, a damp chill that felt like it was creeping right into her bones. The small apartment, once filled with the warm smells of her husband's aftershave and the gentle hum of her sewing machine, now echoed with a cavernous emptiness. Every sound was magnified: the soft, troubled breaths of 1-year-old Sophie sleeping in her carrier, the shuffling of 8-year-old Leo's worn-out sneakers as he bravely tried to stack their last 2 cardboard boxes. He was being quiet, too quiet. Helen felt her heart ache with a physical throb. He was trying to be a man for her, and it was stealing the last remnants of his childhood. A year. It had been 1 year since the phone call that had shattered her world, since her husband's life was extinguished in a mess of twisted metal and corporate indifference. Now, that single tragedy had spiraled, consuming everything they had. The eviction notice, a stark white paper she still saw in her mind's eye, had been the final blow. The landlord's footsteps were approaching in the hall. Time was up. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. Her world had shrunk to a single, terrifying number glowing on the cracked screen of her cheap smartphone. $500. She had checked it a dozen times, as if staring at it could somehow add a zero. $500.00. It was the sum total of their existence, the meager proceeds from selling every tangible memory of their life together. The couch where they'd cuddled to watch movies, the dining table where Leo had done his first scribbled drawings, and the hardest to let go, her Singer sewing machine, its sale feeling like the amputation of her own hands. Now, that money was all that stood between her children and the street. Her stomach twisted into a hard knot, a pain that was part hunger, part pure, undiluted fear. Sophie whimpered in her sleep, a small, hungry sound that sliced right through Helen. She knew that cry. It was the sound of a baby whose mother's milk was thinning from stress and poor nutrition, the sound of a future that was already starting to starve. She felt a cold sweat on her brow. This wasn't just poverty. It was a freefall, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. She looked at Leo, who was staring at a patch of peeling paint on the wall. His small shoulders slumped. He hadn't cried when they packed his toys into a donation bin, not even when she had to explain that they couldn't stay here anymore. He had simply nodded, his eyes wide and serious. That silence was so much worse than tears. It was the silence of a child who understood far too much, who felt the suffocating weight of his mother's despair. Helen ran a hand over his hair, the gesture feeling clumsy and inadequate. A sob caught in her chest, hot and sharp. How could she be their protector when she couldn't even provide a roof over their heads? She clutched the carrier strap, feeling Sophie's small, warm weight against her chest. This tiny, perfect being, completely dependent on her. And she was failing. She was failing them both. The ghosts of her husband's promises, a small house, a yard for the kids, a life of simple security, mocked her in the stark, empty room. All that was left was the scent of dust and desperation. The accident had been ruled a workplace fatality, a tragedy of faulty equipment and cut corners. But the company's lawyers had been sharks, circling the blood in the water, and she, dazed with grief and overwhelmed, had been left with nothing. No compensation, no justice, just a platitude-filled letter and a debt that grew like a malignant tumor. Every night, she lay awake, the silence of the apartment amplifying the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. She would trace the lines on her husband's side of the bed, the empty space a cold, vast continent of loss. He had been her rock, the calm voice that always knew what to do. Now, she was utterly alone, navigating this nightmare with 2 small lives clinging to her. Her hands, once nimble and creative, turning fabric into beautiful dresses, now felt useless. They trembled as she checked her phone again, the $500 balance a digital tombstone marking the death of her old life and the terrifying birth of this new precarious one. The sharp rap on the door made all 3 of them jump. "Time to go, Helen." The landlord's voice was devoid of sympathy. The finality of it was a physical blow. Helen took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of mildew and defeat. She picked up the single duffel bag containing their last few clothes and Leo's favorite book. Leo took her hand, his small fingers gripping hers tightly. She hoisted the baby carrier higher on her shoulder and walked towards the door, not daring to look back. The click of the lock shutting behind them was a deafening sound, a metal punctuation mark on the end of her life's chapter. They stood in the grimy hallway, The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of traffic, seeming loud and predatory. The cold wind from the building's entrance whipped at her face. She looked down at her children, their faces pale in the dim light. A single hot tear escaped and slid down her cheek. She had $500 and no home to go to. Her mind screamed a single, silent question. What now? In the stale, disinfectant-scented air of the 24-hour bus station, Helen's world had shrunk to the harsh glow of her phone screen. Sophie was fussing in her arms, a low, miserable whimper that signaled hunger and the deep discomfort of their upended lives. Leo sat silently beside her on the hard plastic bench, his small face a mask of exhaustion. Helen's own body ached, a deep, weary pain that started in her feet and settled like a stone in her gut. She scrolled through housing ads, her thumb moving numbly over images of apartments she couldn't afford, rooms for rent that didn't allow children, and shelters that were already full. Each listing was a new door slamming in her face. Hope was a currency she no longer possessed. She felt the hollow ache of true hunger now, a gnawing emptiness that mirrored the one in her heart. She had bought a small bag of chips for Leo an hour ago, but had eaten nothing herself. The thought of spending even a single dollar on herself, feeling like an unforgivable extravagance. Her every nerve was frayed, stretched taut with a terror so profound it was almost silent. Then she saw it, an ad so out of place it seemed like a mirage. It was buried deep in a little-known classified site, the kind people used for selling old farm equipment and livestock. The headline was simple: Land of Your Own, a New Start. The location was a town she'd never heard of, a remote pinprick in Appalachian, North Carolina. The photos were blurry, grainy shots of dense woods and what looked like the corner of a rustic cabin. But the description, the description was a siren song to her drowning soul. Your own land with a fixer-upper, a new start away from the chaos of the city. It spoke of peace, of ownership, of a place no one could ever take from them. And then, the price. The number that made her heart stop and her breath catch in her throat. $500, exactly what she had. It felt like fate, a sign from a universe that had, until now, been relentlessly cruel. A tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her despair. A fixer-upper. She could fix things. Her hands were good. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. Her finger hovered over the Buy Now button, trembling. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was everything, all of it. The last shred of their security gambled on a blurry photo and a line of poetic text. Her mind raced, a frantic slideshow of worst-case scenarios. It could be a scam. The land could be a swamp. The fixer-upper could be a pile of sticks. But what was the alternative? A homeless shelter, the back of a bus, separating her children. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp stabbing in her chest. She looked at Leo, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, his head resting against her arm. She looked at Sophie, whose whimpering had subsided into soft, snuffly breaths. They were trusting her. Their entire world rested on this one desperate decision. She squeezed her eyes shut, said a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and pressed the button. The screen changed. Congratulations on your purchase. A cold sweat broke out on her back. There was no turning back now. The money was gone. Her bank account was zero. The bus ride was an odyssey into oblivion. It was a 20-hour journey that crawled through the night and into the next day, each mile taking them deeper into a world that felt alien and foreboding. The bus itself was a rolling microcosm of quiet desperation, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, cheap coffee, and the unwashed bodies of weary travelers. Helen held Sophie tightly, her small body a warm, precious weight against her chest, a living anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Leo sat glued to the window, his eyes wide as the familiar grey sprawl of the city gave way to endless highways, then to rolling hills, and finally to dense, dark forests that crowded the roadside like silent, green giants. Helen's muscles screamed in protest. She hadn't slept, her mind a turbulent storm of hope and fear. She felt the bus ticket stubs in her pocket, their crisp edges a reminder of the money draining away, leaving nothing but this blind faith in a grainy photograph and a desperate dream of a home. They were the only ones who got off at the stop for Cedar Creek, North Carolina. It wasn't a station, just a dusty patch of gravel on the side of a two-lane road, marked by a faded, weather-beaten sign. The bus pulled away with a hiss of air brakes, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving them enveloped in a silence so profound it was almost deafening. The air was different here, thin and sharp, scented with pine and damp earth. It was cold, much colder than the city. Helen shivered, pulling her thin jacket tighter. The isolation was immediate and absolute. There were no other buildings in sight, only the road and the imposing, endless wall of trees on either side. A single rusty pickup truck was waiting, just as the email had promised. The driver, a leathery old man with eyes that seemed to have seen 1,000 hard winters, just nodded at them. "You the ones for the old Abram place?" he grunted, not waiting for an answer as he threw her duffel bag into the truck bed with a thud. The ride in the pickup was a bone-jarring, teeth-rattling ordeal. The truck's engine coughed and sputtered, and every pothole in the crumbling asphalt road sent a jolt through Helen's exhausted body. Soon, the pavement gave way to a gravel road that kicked up a cloud of white dust behind them. Then, the gravel road devolved into a narrow dirt track, barely wide enough for the truck. Overhanging branches scraped against the roof and windows with a screeching sound, like claws trying to get in. "Not many folks come out this way no more," the driver offered, his voice a low rumble. "Not since Abram and his family. Well, not since they left." The cryptic comment sent a chill down Helen's spine, a cold premonition that fluttered in her stomach. The knot of anxiety that had been tightening in her chest was now a hard, painful ball. She could feel the isolation deepening with every lurch of the truck, a wild, untamed feeling that was a world away from the crowded loneliness of the city. Finally, the truck shuddered to a halt in a small, overgrown clearing. "This is it," the driver said, his tone flat. He unloaded her bag and tea without another word, climbed back into his truck. Helen stood frozen as she watched him turn the vehicle around and drive away. The sound of the rattling engine faded, slowly swallowed by the immense silence of the forest, until there was nothing left but the whisper of the wind through the pines and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Her hope, that tiny, fragile seed, withered and died in that moment. Before her stood not a fixer-upper, not a rustic cabin, but a skeleton, a ruin. The structure was a collapsed, rotting carcass of a house, surrendering itself back to the wilderness that surrounded it. It was a nightmare rendered in decaying wood and broken glass. She had traded the last of their money not for a new start, but for a tombstone in the middle of nowhere. Her breath hitched in her throat, a dry, painful gasp. The porch roof sagged at a dangerous angle, held up by a single post that was leaning precariously. Most of the windows were gone, leaving behind black, vacant holes that stared at her like the empty eye sockets of a skull. A huge section of the main roof had caved in, exposing the dark, rotting innards of the house to the grey, unforgiving sky. Wild vines and thorny bushes grew up the walls, their tendrils creeping through the broken windows and a gaping hole in the foundation, as if nature itself was actively consuming the last remnants of the structure. The wood of the walls was grey and splintered, blackened in patches by years of damp and rot. A feeling of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over Helen. It was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't a place that needed fixing. This was a place that needed to be forgotten. She felt Leo's small hand slip into hers, his fingers cold and trembling. With a sense of dread so heavy it felt like a physical weight on her shoulders, Helen walked towards the front door. It hung crookedly on a single rusty hinge. She pushed it, and it swung inward with a long, agonized groan of tortured metal and swelling wood, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. And then the smell hit her. It was a physical assault, a thick, suffocating wave of black mold, stagnant water, and years of animal decay. It was the smell of a place where things had come to die. It was so potent it made her gag, her stomach churning violently. She instinctively pulled the collar of her shirt over Sophie's face, trying to shield her from the toxic air. The smell clung to the inside of her throat, a foul taste of rot and ruin. This wasn't just the smell of abandonment, it was the smell of disease, of a deep and settled sickness in the very bones of the house. A wave of nausea made her dizzy, and she had to brace herself against the doorframe to keep from falling. Stepping inside was like entering a crypt. The floor was a treacherous landscape of debris, splintered planks, fallen plaster, sodden leaves, and the droppings of countless animals. Her first step inside was met with a wet, squelching crunch. Water dripped from the ceiling with a slow, maddeningly steady rhythm, landing in a murky puddle in the center of the main room. The walls were a horrifying tapestry of black and green. They weren't just stained with mold, they were covered in it, a slick, furry texture that seemed to pulse in the dim light filtering through the collapsed roof. The air was thick and heavy, each breath feeling like she was inhaling spores of pure decay. She could feel the dampness seeping into her clothes, into her very skin. A rat scurried across the floor in front of her, a dark shape that disappeared into a hole in the wall. A shiver of pure revulsion coursed through her. This place was not uninhabited. It was teeming with things that thrived in the darkness and the rot. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any sign of hope, any salvageable corner. There was none. Where a light switch should have been, there was only a hole in the wall with frayed, dead wires sticking out like severed nerves. She stumbled towards what might have once been a kitchen area. A rusted cast-iron sink was half torn from the wall. She turned the single corroded tap with a creak of metal. A sputtering cough of air and a shower of rust flakes was the only answer. No electricity, no running water, no shelter from the cold wind that whistled through the 100 cracks and holes in the structure. They were completely, utterly cut off. The isolation she had felt on the road was nothing compared to this. Here, in this rotting shell, they were adrift in a sea of hostile wilderness. If they screamed, no one would hear. If they needed help, none would come. It was a trap, a $500 trap, and she had walked her children right into it. The sounds of the house were a symphony of horror. The constant, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water was like a slow torture, each drop marking another second of her catastrophic failure. The wind moaned as it moved through the broken frame of the building, a low, mournful sound like a distant cry of pain. From within the walls came a constant, subtle scratching and scuttling, the sound of unseen creatures making their homes in the decay. This wasn't the silence of peace she had dreamed of. It was a heavy, watchful silence, pregnant with the sounds of desolation. She imagined the night falling, the temperature dropping, the darkness filling this space and bringing with it whatever creatures hunted in the woods. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. This wasn't a house. It wasn't a home. It was a grave, waiting to be filled, and she had brought her children here to die. The weight of her failure was absolute, a crushing physical force. The last of her strength evaporated. Her legs, which had carried her for so long, simply gave out. Helen sank to the filthy, debris-strewn floor, not even caring about the dampness and the dirt that soaked into her jeans. She pulled Leo into her, his small, shivering body pressing against her side. The dam of her composure, so carefully constructed for so long, finally shattered. A sob as raw and ragged tore from her throat, followed by another and another. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of hope being utterly extinguished. The tears she had held back for so long now came in a hot, blinding flood, streaming down her face and mixing with the grime on her skin. She had done this. Her desperate gamble had failed in the most spectacular way possible. She had taken their last dollar, their last chance, and thrown it into this black hole of decay. She had led her babies into a place worse than any shelter, worse than the street. She felt a wave of self-loathing so intense, it made her feel sick. How could she have been so stupid, so naive? The ad's words echoed in her mind, a cruel mockery, a new start. This was an ending. She hugged Leo tighter, burying her face in his hair, trying to muffle the sounds of her own despair. He didn't say a word, just clung to her, his silence a testament to a terror he was too young to process. In her arms, Sophie, disturbed by the cold and her mother's shaking, began to wail, a piercing, hungry cry that seemed to fill the vast empty ruin. The sound was an accusation. It was the sound of her failure. Helen's own sobs subsided into silent, hot tears of utter defeat. She was trapped. She was penniless. She was responsible for the two small and precious lives, now shivering in a rotting shack in the middle of a hostile wilderness. She had hit the bottom, and as she looked around the dark, mold-infested room, she realized the ground beneath her was 1,000 times colder and harder than she had ever feared. The sun bled out behind the jagged peaks of the Appalachians, pulling the last of the day's warmth with it and plunging the clearing into a deep, chilling twilight. The temperature dropped with an alarming speed, and a cold wind began to howl through the skeleton of the house, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the loneliness of the entire wilderness. Despair was a luxury Helen could no longer afford. The raw animal instinct for survival began to override her grief. She looked at Leo, his face pale and smudged with dirt, and at Sophie, shivering even in her arms. They needed shelter. They needed a space, however small, that was safe from the wind and the damp. Her gaze fell on a corner of the main room, one less exposed to the gaping hole in the roof. "Come on, Leo," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Can you help me clear a space? Just a little one. We just need to make it through the night." Numbly, she began to push aside pieces of fallen plaster and splintered wood, her mind focused on a single, grim task. The world had shrunk to this one rotting room. Leo, eager to help, to do something, anything to combat the fear that had settled over them, began kicking at a pile of sodden leaves and debris near the wall. He was trying to be strong for her, and the sight of his small, very determined effort sent a fresh pang of love and pain through Helen's heart. He grunted with effort, pushing a larger piece of broken planking aside with his worn-out sneaker. As he took a step back, his foot caught on something. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the mouldy wall before he could fall. "Whoa!" he gasped. It wasn't the trip that caught Helen's attention, but the sound. Amid the groans of the house and the whisper of the wind, there had been a distinct, peculiar noise. Not the solid thud of foot on floor, but a hollow, wooden thump, followed by a strange, low creak, like a hinge that hadn't moved in a lifetime. It was a sound that didn't belong, an anomaly in the symphony of decay. It was a sound with a question mark at the end of it. It was a sound that made Helen stop moving, her breath held tight in her chest. Helen's gaze fixed on the spot where Leo had tripped. It looked like any other section of the grimy floor, a collection of dark, wide wooden planks, but one of them sat just slightly askew, its edge a fraction of an inch higher than its neighbors. The sound it had made, it wasn't the creak of old age. It was the sound of something shifting, something hollow underneath, a tiny spark of curiosity, the first emotion other than terror she had felt in hours, flickered to life within her. It was absurd. It was probably nothing. Just another rotten piece of this god-forsaken house. But in a world where she had absolutely nothing left to lose, where the future was a black, formless void, even the smallest mystery was a lifeline to cling to. She knelt down, her knees protesting against the hard, damp wood. She pressed on the edge of the board with her fingers. It moved. It didn't just bend or creak. It pivoted slightly, confirming the hollow space beneath. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. What was this? Her bare hands were useless against the stubborn wood. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the debris-strewn floor around her, a chaotic jumble of the house's own remains. Near the crumbling foundation, her eyes caught the glint of oxidized metal. It was a length of steel rebar, bent and rusted, probably left over from the original construction. She grabbed it, the cold, rough texture of the rust a gritty reality in her palm. The bar was heavy, a crude but effective tool. It felt strangely empowering to hold it. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't just a victim of this place. She was about to act upon it, to force one of its secrets into the light. Crouching again, she wedged the tip of the rebar into the thin gap between the planks. She took a deep breath, the foul air filling her lungs, and put all of her weight, all of her frustration, all of her desperate, frantic energy into the task. Her muscles screamed in protest, unused to such labor. This place would not beat her, not yet. She had to know what was under here. With a long, agonizing shriek of tortured metal, the old nails began to pull free from the supporting joist below. The sound was deafeningly loud in the otherwise silent room, echoing off the damp walls. Leo and Sophie both flinched. Leo moved closer to his mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, watching as she wrestled with the house itself. Helen gritted her teeth, her knuckles white as she pushed down on the rebar. The wood groaned, splintered, and resisted. For a moment, she thought the old plank would break apart before it came loose, but then, with a final, sharp crack of surrendering timber, the board popped free. It flipped over, landing with a loud clatter on the floor beside the opening it had concealed for so long. Helen, breathing heavily, stared down into the hole. A gust of cold, musty air rushed up to meet her, a subterranean breath that had been held for decades. It was a smell entirely different from the mold and rot of the house. It was the pure, clean smell of deep earth, of darkness, and of time itself. The opening was a perfect, dark square cut into the dirt floor beneath the house. It wasn't a formal cellar, just a smaller hand-dug compartment, maybe 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide, a hiding place. The darkness inside was absolute, a profound blackness that seemed to swallow the dim twilight filtering into the room. A primal fear pricked at her. Spiders and snakes, dead things. Her mind supplied a litany of horrors that could be lurking in that hole, but the mystery was stronger than her fear. She pulled out her phone, her heart sinking as she saw the battery icon glowing red at 7%. It was her only light. She switched on the screen, its weak, digital glow seeming pathetic against the immense darkness. She held it over the hole, the pale light cutting a small circle into the gloom. Her breath hitched. Down in the shallow, earthy pit nestled in the dark soil was an object, a bundle, a dark, lumpy shape wrapped in what looked like old, mouldy rags. It sat there, waiting, as it had for countless years, for this very moment of discovery. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The single drip of water from the ceiling seemed to mark each beat. Drip, thump, drip, thump. The world had narrowed to the small circle of light from her phone and the unknown object sitting at the bottom of the hole. For a long moment, she just stared, her mind paralyzed by 100 different possibilities. What if it was something terrible? What if it was better left alone? But the thought of her children shivering in the cold, their future a terrifying blank, pushed her forward. She couldn't go back, and there was no way forward. There was only through. Taking another shaky breath to steady her nerves, she laid the phone on the floor, angling its light into the hole. Then, forcing down a wave of revulsion, she reached her hand into the cold, dark space. The air inside was frigid, and the smell of damp earth intensified, filling her nostrils with the scent of a freshly dug grave. Her fingers brushed against the bundle, and she recoiled for a second. The rags were shockingly cold and slimy to the touch, saturated with decades of subterranean dampness. They felt like they might disintegrate in her hand. Beneath the foul-smelling fabric, her fingers felt something firm, yet pliable. Leather. Old, hardened leather. It was a bag of some kind. Her fear began to war with a new feeling, a thrilling electric current of anticipation. This was not a random object. This was deliberately hidden. Someone had gone to great trouble to dig this hole, to place this item within it, and to conceal it so carefully. Someone who didn't want it to be found. Gulping, she firmed her grip on the object, her fingers finding purchase on the surprisingly solid mass. It was heavier than it looked. With a grunt of effort, she began to lift it out of its earthen tomb. Dirt and bits of rotted cloth rained down as she carefully hoisted it into the dim light of the room, her muscles straining with the unexpected weight. It was a satchel, she could see now. A small, rotting leather satchel. She placed it carefully on the cleanest patch of floor she could find. It was a relic from another time. The dark brown leather was cracked and covered in patches of white and green mold. The stitching along the seams was rotting away, and the single brass buckle on the front was corroded and green with age. Leo crept closer, his initial fear replaced by a child's pure curiosity. "What is it, Mom?" he whispered, his voice a small sound in the vast, quiet room. "I don't know, baby," Helen whispered back, her eyes never leaving the mysterious object. Her own heart was hammering against her ribs. It felt like every hope she'd ever had, every fear she was currently living, was contained within this single odd-rotting bag. It was a Pandora's box of the Appalachian woods, and she was about to open it. She could feel the weight of its history, the silent story it held. The whole house, the whole forest, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do, what she would find inside. The brass buckle wouldn't budge. It was fused shut by time and moisture. Impatient, Helen used the tip of the rebar to pry at it. With a sharp snap of protesting metal, the corroded latch broke. The flap of the satchel fell open with a soft sigh of decaying leather. A new smell wafted out, overpowering the scent of mold and earth. It was the dry, dusty scent of old paper, and underneath that a strange mineral tang, like rocks after a rainstorm. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. The contents were wrapped in another layer of fabric. This one an oilcloth that was stiff and brittle. She carefully peeled back a corner. The weak light of her phone screen, her last 7% of battery, fell upon the contents, and her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, battered and exhausted, struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. It was impossible. It made no sense. It was a sight so alien to her life of poverty and struggle that for a moment she was certain she was dreaming. At first, it just looked like a pile of dull as greenish-grey rocks. They weren't sparkling or cut like jewels in a store. They were rough, opaque, and lumpy, nestled in the rotting cloth like eggs in a dirty nest. But as she shifted the bag, one of the stones rolled, and the phone's light caught it at a different angle. For a fraction of a second, a flash of deep, brilliant green light seemed to glow from within the stone, a flash of impossible color in the monochrome decay of the room. It wasn't a reflection. It was a deep, internal fire. Helen's heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop altogether. She had seen pictures of such things in books, in documentaries. She had never imagined she would see one in real life, and let alone hold one. Her mind whispered a word, a name for the stone that felt like a fantasy: emerald. The satchel was full of them, dozens of rough, uncut, unpolished emeralds, a fortune. A king's ransom sitting here in the dirt and the dark. She picked one up. It was heavy in her palm, surprisingly so, and cold to the touch, like a stone pulled from a deep, fast-moving river. She turned it over and over, the phone's weak light revealing the rough hexagonal crystal structure, the milky inclusions, and the astonishing vibrant green that seemed to pulse within its core. It felt ancient, powerful, a piece of the earth's hidden heart. She looked from the stone in her hand to the pile of them in the bag, then to her son's awestruck face, then to the crumbling walls around them. The sheer cognitive dissonance was staggering. It was like finding a pot of gold in the middle of a war zone. This level of wealth, this impossible dream, didn't belong in her world of eviction notices and 35-cent bank balances. A wave of dizziness swept over her. Her exhausted mind refused to accept it. This had to be a hallucination, a cruel joke played by hunger and despair. She felt the smooth, hard reality of the stone in her hand, and knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was real. A sob, not of sadness, but of pure, overwhelming shock, escaped her lips. Her entire body began to shake. She wasn't happy. She was terrified. This kind of discovery didn't happen to people like her. It was the stuff of fairy tales and, more often, of tragedies. This treasure didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a burden, a secret so immense it could crush her. She quickly looked around, her eyes darting into the deep shadows of the room, as if the fortune's rightful or wrongful owner might be lurking there, watching her. The sound of her own blood roaring in her ears was louder than the wind outside. She gently, almost reverently, placed the single emerald back with its brethren. Her shaking hands went back into the satchel, her fingers brushing against something flat and solid beneath the pile of stones. There was more. The emeralds were not the only secret this bag had been protecting all these years. There was something else hidden at the very bottom. Carefully, she lifted the pile of emeralds out of the satchel, placing them in a small heap on her jacket to protect them from the dirt. Her hands felt clumsy, her movements jerky. Underneath where they had rested was a slim package wrapped in what remained of a piece of oilcloth. The fabric was so old it crumbled to dust as she touched it. Inside were two items. The first was a small, thin book, its leather cover warped and stained by moisture, but miraculously intact. The second was a sheaf of thicker, folded papers, yellowed with age and bearing the unmistakable look of official documents. Helen's heart hammered. This was it. This was the story. The emeralds were the what, but this was the why. The papers felt sacred in her hands, a testament from a ghost. On the cover of the small book, the faded, embossed gold lettering was just barely legible in the phone's light. There was a name. Abram. The name the old truck driver had spoken. A cold electric jolt went through her. This wasn't just a story, it was his story, with hands that trembled so much she could barely control them. She set the diary aside and carefully unfolded the larger documents. The paper was dangerously brittle, and a small piece of one corner flaked off and turned to dust. It was a deed of title. The formal, typewritten legal language was archaic, but the meaning was clear. It was the original deed to this very land. She saw the surveyor's marks, the legal description of the property lines, and she saw the name of the grantee, Abram Walker, and the date. Stamped in purple ink, now faded to a pale lavender, was the year 1978. This was proof, tangible, legal proof that this land, this ruin, this hidden treasure, had once belonged to a man named Abram, a man who had been here, who had walked this floor, who had hidden his life's work in a hole and then vanished. The paper in her hands did not feel like a document. It felt like a voice from the grave, a voice that had waited decades to be heard, and had chosen her. Of all people as its audience, she set the deed down with a reverence she didn't know she possessed and picked up the small, leather-bound book, the diary. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a surprisingly neat, looping cursive, the ink a faded sepia. The first entries were mundane, beautiful in their simplicity. May 12, 1978. Sarah planted the tomatoes today. The boy helped. Rain is coming. I can smell it. May 18, 1978. Fixed the pump handle. The woods are quiet today, only the sound of the wrens. Reading the words felt like an intimate violation, a glimpse into a life that was not hers. It was the journal of a man who loved his family, who loved this land. He wrote of his wife, Sarah, and their young son. He wrote of the hardships and the simple joys of a life carved out of the wilderness. Helen felt a profound and painful connection to this ghost. His dreams were not so different from the ones she had lost. He had simply wanted to build a safe world for the people he loved, here in this very spot. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning Abram's life. Then, about halfway through the diary, the tone changed. The neat script became more hurried, more excited. July 2nd, 1978. I saw it again, a gleam of green in the creek bed after the storm. Not moss, something else, something hard. The entries became obsessive, focused on this single discovery. He wrote of digging, of following the trail, of a small cave-in that revealed not just a few stones, but a vein, a rich vein of green stones running deep into the hillside. July 29th, 1978. It is real. God in heaven, it is real. Enough to give my Sarah the finest things. Enough for the boy to go to any college he wants. We are saved. Helen's throat tightened. She could feel his joy, his soaring hope, radiating from the faded ink on the page. It was the same lottery winner's shock she had felt just moments before, but his was pure, untainted by fear. He believed he had found a miracle. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. The name appeared a few pages later, a dark blot on the story of hope. August 14th, 1978. Silas Blackwood came by today. The entry was short, tense. Abram described the man as a hawk, with eyes that saw everything and a smile that held no warmth. Blackwood, a powerful landowner who owned most of the surrounding territory, had heard whispers of Abram's find. He made an offer to buy the land, an insulting sum that was a fraction of what the timber alone was worth. He wants what is mine. I saw it in his eyes. When I said no, his smile vanished. He told me this is a lonely place. He told me accidents happen. The words sent a cold dread seeping into Helen's bones. The story was becoming horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a fairy tale about finding treasure. It was a ghost story, a noir thriller written in faded ink, and she was standing on the stage where the final bloody act had taken place. The name Blackwood felt like a curse spoken aloud in the dark. The following entries were a descent into paranoia and fear. The handwriting grew more frantic. The lines slanted and hurried. September 5th, 1978. Blackwood's men were at the edge of the property again. They just stood there, watching. September 12th, 1978. Someone fouled the well during the night. The water is undrinkable. Sarah is terrified. September 21st, 1978. My boy came running home from the road, said a truck tried to run him off. I know it was them. Blackwood is trying to break me. Helen felt a suffocating empathy for this man she had never met. She could feel his terror, his helplessness as this powerful, ruthless force squeezed his life, trying to crush him into submission. Each entry was a step closer to the inevitable, a chronicle of a good man being systematically destroyed by a greedy one. Helen's hand holding the phone was shaking so badly, the light danced across the page, making the frantic words seem to squirm like living things. She turned to the last written page. The ink was dark, smudged. The words scrawled with such haste they were barely legible. It was dated September 28, 1978. It was short, a final, desperate message to a world that would not listen. He is done waiting. I can feel it. I have hidden it all. The stones, the real deed, under the floor. In case something happens, God protect Sarah and my boy. They are all I have. I hear a truck on the road. It's late. Too late for a friendly visit. Oh God. They are here. The words ended in a long, trailing slash of ink where the pen had been dragged across the page. That was it. The story just stopped. The next page was blank. And the page after that. The empty, silent pages screamed louder than any of Abram's written words. Helen slammed the diary shut, a choked gasp escaping her lips. They are here. The phrase echoed in the silent, ruined house. It was a last testament, a confession signed under duress, a final, horrifying period at the end of a life. Disappeared. The truck driver's word hung in the air. Abram and his family hadn't left. They hadn't moved away. They had been taken. They had been erased. A wave of nausea, acrid and hot, rose in Helen's throat. This wasn't just a house. It was a crime scene. The treasure she had found wasn't a gift from heaven. It was evidence. It was the motive for a triple murder that had been buried for decades under layers of dirt, silence, and fear. She looked at the emeralds, gleaming dully on her jacket. They didn't look like a fortune anymore. They looked like blood money. They were stained with the memory of what had been done to acquire them, and what had been done to the man who had tried to keep them. The cold of the floor seemed to seep into her very soul, a chilling premonition that this story was not over. By unearthing this treasure, she hadn't just found Abram's fortune, she had found his ghost, and she feared she had also found his enemy. A profound shift occurred in the room. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken history. The house was no longer just a ruin, it was haunted now, filled with the presence of the family that had been stolen from it. The dripping water was no longer a simple leak. It was the sound of time counting down. The scratching in the walls was no longer just rats. It was the sound of buried secrets clawing their way to the surface. Helen felt a terror far colder and deeper than the fear of poverty. This was the fear of violence, of ruthless men who took what they wanted and erased anyone who stood in their way. She was no longer just a destitute widow. She was now the sole keeper of a terrible secret, the holder of a fortune that had already cost one family their lives. She was a witness, decades after the fact, to a crime that had never been punished. The name Blackwood was no longer just a name in a diary. It was a living threat, and it was only a matter of time before that threat came looking for what it had lost. The fragile battery of her phone finally died, plunging the room into an oppressive, absolute darkness. The emeralds, now hidden away in her jacket pocket, were no longer a source of light, but a cold, heavy weight of responsibility. Helen's mind, a whirlwind of shock and terror, began to frantically piece together the horrifying narrative she had unearthed. This land was not just abandoned, it was stolen. The silence of the forest was not peaceful. It was the silence of a buried scream. Abram, Sarah, their boy, their ghosts were here. Their story imprinted on the very air she breathed. She was sitting in their tomb, a tomb purchased for $500. The dripping water from the roof was no longer just water. It was a timer, counting down the seconds since she had disturbed a decades-old crime. A cold sweat slicked her skin. The diary was a confession, the deed was a motive, and the emeralds were a death sentence. She was no longer a victim of poverty, she was a witness to a murder, and the killer's shadow still loomed large over this dark piece of earth. A sudden sound from outside made her flinch violently, her heart leaping into her throat. It was just an owl, a low hoot echoing through the trees, but in her heightened state of fear, it sounded like a warning. She realized with a jolt of panic that her arrival was not a secret. The old truck driver, he knew. He had dropped her here. In a place this small, this isolated, news would travel not like wildfire but like a slow, creeping vine, passed in hushed tones over a crackling phone line or across a worn-out counter at a general store miles away. The name Blackwood, spoken aloud in her mind, felt like a summons. They would hear about the woman and her 2 small children who had come to live in the old Abram place. They would wonder. They would come to investigate. The isolation that had seemed like a trap now felt like a cage with the lion's keeper on his way. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the shadows, but she knew it was futile. She had lit a flare in the dark, and something was bound to see the light. She spent the rest of the night in a state of sleepless terror, huddled with her children in the cold, dark corner. Every gust of wind was the sound of footsteps. Every creak of the rotting house was the sound of a door being forced open. When the first weak, grey light of dawn finally filtered through the collapsed roof, it brought no relief, only a clearer view of her horrifying reality. She knew she had to leave, but where could she go? She had no money, no car, no one to call. They were marooned on this island of death. She gave Leo the last of the chips from the bus station and nursed Sophie, her body trembling with a mixture of cold, hunger, and adrenaline. The emeralds in her pocket felt like burning coals. They were her only hope and her greatest danger. Could she just walk away, leave the satchel behind, pretend she never found it? The image of Abram's last, frantic words flashed in her mind. God protect Sarah and my boy. She looked at Leo and Sophie. No, she couldn't just walk away. This was about more than just money now. It was about justice. The sound came mid-morning, a low, powerful hum that was utterly alien to the wilderness. It was not the exhausted rattle of the old man's pickup truck. It was the confident, expensive purr of a modern engine. Helen scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm. Peeking through a crack in the rotting wall, she saw it. A sleek black sedan, impossibly clean, had rolled into the clearing and stopped. The sunlight glinted off its polished chrome, a painful, intrusive flash of wealth in the middle of the decay. A man in a tailored dark suit stepped out. He was tall, in his late 50s, with silvering hair combed perfectly back from his forehead. He moved with a calm, predatory grace, his polished leather shoes navigating the debris-strewn ground without a hint of hesitation. He was not looking at the house with surprise or pity. He was looking at it with an unnerving sense of ownership, his cold blue eyes scanning the property as if taking inventory. A knot of ice formed in Helen's stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, exactly who this was. He walked directly to the front door and stopped, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of the clearing. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, waiting, as if he knew she was inside, and that his mere arrival was a summons she could not ignore. Helen's mind screamed at her to stay hidden, to keep the children quiet, to pray he would just leave. But where would she hide? He stood between her and the only way out. Taking a shuddering breath that felt like inhaling shards of glass, she moved towards the groaning door. She had to face him. She had to know. She pulled the door open just enough to see him clearly. He gave her a smile that was perfectly crafted, a politician's smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Good morning," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was as out of place here as his suit. "You must be the new owner. I'm Arthur Blackwood. My family has owned most of the land around here for generations. I thought I'd stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood." The name hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the world tilt on its axis. She couldn't speak. The name Blackwood echoed in the haunted chambers of her mind, locking her jaw and turning her blood to ice. It was him, the son, the inheritor of Silas's sins. He was older now, but she could see the hawk-like intensity Abram had described lurking behind the polite facade. He extended a hand, and numbly, mechanically, she took it. His grip was firm, dry and cold as a tombstone. His cologne, a subtle scent of cedar and something musky, wafted towards her, a smell of money and power that was a nauseating counterpoint to the house's stench of mold and death. "Helen?" she managed to whisper, her own name sounding foreign and weak. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure he could hear it. She felt Leo press up against the back of her legs, hiding from the stranger, and she put a protective hand on his head, the gesture as much to steady herself as to comfort him. This man was the ghost she had feared, made flesh and blood, and he was standing on her doorstep. Arthur Blackwood's eyes flickered past her, taking in the squalor of the room behind her. A look of perfectly feigned pity crossed his features. "My goodness," he said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "The online ad didn't do this place justice, did it? It's a complete ruin. Frankly, it's a hazard. I'm surprised they were even allowed to sell it." He let his gaze drift over the collapsed roof, the mold-caked walls. "My father, Silas, used to talk about the family who lived here. The Walkers. A sad story. They just up and left one day, decades ago. Abandoned the place. Some people just aren't cut out for a life in the mountains." The casual, dismissive way he spoke the name of the man his father had murdered, made a hot, furious bile rise in Helen's throat. He was testing her. He was weaving a false history, waiting to see if she would correct it. She remained silent, her face a pale, frozen mask, her mind screaming. The emeralds felt like a physical weight, pulling her down, threatening to betray their presence. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, his cold eyes studying her face. Searching for any flicker of knowledge, he saw only a terrified, destitute woman. "Look," he said, changing his tone to one of magnanimous generosity. "I feel responsible. A young woman, children, it's not safe for you here. The place is worthless, a tear down. But I'll tell you what." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a gold pen. The flash of gold was obscene in this place of decay. "I feel bad that you were swindled. I'll give you $1,000 for the deed. Cash it today. It's more than this land is worth, but it would get you and your children on a bus, back to civilization, somewhere safe. A fresh start. Think of it as a gift from a concerned neighbor." The offer was a calculated insult, a confirmation of everything she feared. He wanted the land. He wanted it quietly. And he thought she was desperate and stupid enough to hand it over for pocket change. Helen's mind was a maelstrom. $1,000. It was double what she'd paid. Enough to escape this immediate trap, but it was also a pittance, a crumb from the feast he hoped to claim, and she knew what that feast was, the emeralds, the mine. He had been searching for them. For decades, the diary implied, the Blackwood family had held the stolen land, but they had never found Abram's treasure. Her arrival, her purchase of this specific forgotten plot, must have set off alarm bells. He wasn't here out of kindness. He was here to get rid of her, to get the last piece of the puzzle, the original deed, and to finally claim the fortune that his father had murdered for. The checkbook in his hand wasn't an offer of help. It was a weapon meant to disarm her with her own desperation. If she took it, she would be validating his theft, erasing Abram's claim forever, and walking away from the only chance at justice this family ever had. Her silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken knowledge. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible, but it hung in the air between them with the force of a gunshot. "Thank you, but no." Arthur Blackwood's smile did not falter, but a change occurred in his eyes. The manufactured warmth vanished, replaced by a flat, cold stillness, the look of a predator whose prey has unexpectedly shown teeth. He slowly, deliberately, put his checkbook and his gold pen back into his pocket. He had his answer. Her refusal was not the defiance of a proud woman. He would have understood that. It was the hesitation of someone who knew something, the hesitation of someone who had found something. He had been looking for those deeds, for that treasure, for 30 years. He had combed this property a dozen times himself, and now this waif, this nobody, had stumbled onto it in a matter of days. A flicker of furious disbelief crossed his face before being smoothed over once more by his practiced, cordial mask. His gaze left her face and drifted slowly, deliberately, around the clearing. He gestured vaguely towards the dense, dark woods that pressed in on all sides. "It's a very isolated place out here, Helen," he said, his voice losing its smooth, generous tone and taking on a harder, flatter edge. "Very isolated. Lots of old wells on these properties. The ground can be unstable. People get lost in these woods all the time." The words were casual, but the intent was as sharp and as clear as a shard of broken glass. It was a threat, a direct echo of his father's words to Abram, a piece of dark family history repeating itself. He was telling her that she was alone, that she was vulnerable, and that the wilderness held 1,000 ways for a person to simply Disappear. Helen felt a chill so profound it seemed to freeze the marrow in her bones. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively pulled Leo tighter against her leg, a useless gesture against a threat so powerful and amorphous. Then, Arthur Blackwood did the one thing that shattered her terror and replaced it with a cold, hard fury. His eyes, those chillingly calm blue eyes, dropped from her face and settled on Leo, who was peeking out from behind her legs. Then his gaze moved to the carrier where Sophie was sleeping, oblivious to the danger that had just walked into their lives. He looked at her children. He held the gaze for a long, pointed moment, a silence that screamed louder than any shout. He didn't have to say a word. The message was delivered with brutal, surgical precision. I see them. I know what you value. His smile returned, but this time it was a thin, cruel slash in his face. Accidents happen, he said softly. The words a near-perfect quote from Abram's diary. The phrase, spoken in this man's cold voice, was not a warning. It was a promise. He was telling her that the accidents that befell people who stood in his way could just as easily befall a small boy or a helpless baby. He gave a curt, dismissive nod, as if concluding a business meeting. "You think about my offer," he said, his voice once again the smooth baritone of the influential lawyer. "I'm a patient man, but this land, it has a way of swallowing things." He turned without another word and walked back to his gleaming black sedan. The car door shut with a solid, expensive thud. The engine started, and with a crunch of tires on gravel, he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his cologne and the suffocating weight of his threat hanging in the air. Helen stood frozen in the doorway, her knuckles white where she gripped the rotting wood. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the noise of his arrival. It was the silence of a countdown, the silence of a trap being set. She was no longer just a woman who had stumbled upon a secret. She was a target, and so were her children. The full, crushing weight of her predicament landed on her. She had the truth in her hands, but the devil knew she had it. The sound of the car faded, and Helen finally collapsed against the doorframe, her legs giving out. Sobs, not of despair, but of pure, terrified rage, shook her entire body. He had threatened her children. He had stood there, in his $1,000 suit, and threatened to harm her babies to get his hands on a dead man's fortune. The emeralds in her pocket now felt like weapons. The diary was no longer just a story. It was her testimony. Abram's fight was now her fight. She was no longer just protecting her children from poverty. She was protecting them from a monster. The impossible choice before her was a razor's edge. If she ran, he would hunt her down. He knew her name. He could find her. If she stayed, she was a sitting duck, waiting for the accident he had promised. The only path forward was through him, through the truth. But how could she, a penniless, friendless widow, fight a man with that much power, that much ruthlessness? How could she expose a crime that had been buried for a generation? She looked down at the satchel, at the proof of a life stolen and a fortune hidden. It was a choice between two impossibilities. She could hand over the fortune, the deed, and the diary to the son of the man who had murdered for it, praying he would let her and her children disappear. Or she could hold on to this terrible truth and try to fight, risking the full, terrifying wrath of Arthur Blackwood being brought down upon her and her family. She was trapped between a ghost's plea for justice and a monster's promise of violence. The weight of the emeralds, the legacy of Abram, and the lives of her children all rested on her next move. The wind howled through the ruin, sounding like a voice from the grave, asking her what she would do. And as she stood there, shaking in the doorway of the crumbling house, the question was no longer just for her. What would you do in her place? Would you give up the secret to save your children? Or would you risk everything to fight for justice? The icy knot of fear in Helen's stomach, twisted tight by Arthur Blackwood's veiled threats, began to transform. A slow, burning heat spread through her veins, a fury so potent it momentarily eclipsed her terror. He had threatened her children. The thought was a relentless, stabbing rhythm in her mind. This was no longer just about a dead man's treasure or a historical injustice. This was primal. This was a mother protecting her young. But how? Her mind raced, a frantic search for an escape route from a perfectly constructed trap. Then, a memory surfaced through the fog of panic. The old truck driver, the man who had dropped them in this hell. He had spoken of Abram's family, and then he had mentioned a neighbor. Not many folks come out this way no more. He'd grunted. A neighbor. An old man, living miles away. It was a sliver of a chance, a desperate gamble, but it was the only piece on the board that wasn't controlled by Blackwood. She had to find him. She had to find this ghost from the past before Blackwood's promised accident became her future. The decision crystallized with chilling clarity. She could not wait for him to return. Every moment spent in this ruin was a moment he was planning, mobilizing, closing his net. She moved with a sudden, desperate purpose. She retrieved the leather satchel, the source of all this hope and terror. The cold weight of the emeralds felt immense, a physical burden of secrets and blood. She wrapped the satchel in her own thin jacket and pushed it deep into the duffel bag, burying it beneath their few spare clothes. "Leo," she said, her voice a strained whisper she barely recognized as her own. "We're going to go for a walk, a long one." The boy looked up at her, his face a small, pale question mark in the gloom. He nodded without a word, his unquestioning trust a fresh wound in her heart. She was leading him out of one danger and into the vast, unknown peril of the wilderness. She strapped Sophie's carrier to her chest, the baby's soft, sleeping breaths a fragile counterpoint to the wild hammering of her own heart. She took a last look at the rotting house, a tomb of secrets, and stepped out into the oppressive silence of the forest. The air outside the ruin was no less menacing. The dirt track she had followed in the rattling pickup truck was her only guide. It was a faint brown ribbon winding through an ocean of green and shadow. The forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of ancient trees whose dense canopy blocked out the sky, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The sun was still high, but here it was cool and dim, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Each step was an effort. The ground was uneven, littered with tangled roots and sharp stones that threatened to turn her ankle. She held Leo's hand in a grip that was probably too tight, a desperate anchor to reality. Sophie, a precious, warm weight on her chest, began to stir, her small movements a reminder of the immense fragility of the lives she was trying to save. The duffel bag, containing the weight of a fortune and the proof of a murder, bumped against her hip with every step, a constant, heavy reminder of the stakes. This wasn't an escape. It was a desperate pilgrimage towards a hope she wasn't even sure existed. The journey was a slow-motion nightmare. Hours bled into one another. Measured only by the shifting patterns of sunlight that managed to pierce the canopy, Helen's body, already weakened by days of stress and poor nutrition, began to protest. A dull ache started in her feet and radiated up her legs, turning into a burning agony. Her shoulders screamed from the weight of the baby carrier. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. Leo, who had been so brave, so stoic, began to falter. His steps grew slower, his small body sagging with exhaustion. "Mom, how much farther?" he asked, his voice a weary whine. "My legs feel like noodles." Helen felt a surge of guilt so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She was forcing him through this ordeal, dragging him into a danger he couldn't possibly comprehend, all based on a half-remembered comment from a stranger. She bit her lip, the sharp pain a welcome distraction from the despair that threatened to swallow her. "Not much farther, honey," she lied, her voice cracking. "We're almost there. Just hold my hand. We have to keep going." Every sound in the forest was amplified, distorted by her fear. The rustle of a squirrel in the undergrowth was the sound of a man stalking them. The caw of a crow from a high branch was a lookout, announcing their position. The wind whispering through the pines sounded like menacing voices, murmuring the name Blackwood. Her senses were on fire, overloaded with a constant stream of potential threats. The air, thick with the scent of pine, was also heavy with the smell of her own fear sweat. She could feel the rough bark of a tree as she leaned against it for a brief, breathless moment of rest, the texture scratching her skin. Leo's hand in hers felt small and terrifyingly fragile. She could feel his pulse, a rapid, bird-like flutter that matched her own. A wave of nausea washed over her. What if she was wrong? What if there was no neighbor? What if she was just leading her children deeper into a wilderness that would simply swallow them whole, another accident, to be forgotten by time? They had been walking for what felt like an eternity. The weak sunlight began to take on a golden afternoon hue, signaling that the day was starting to wane. Her hope, which had been a flickering candle flame, was beginning to gutter. Leo was openly crying now, quiet, exhausted sobs that tore at her heart. "I can't walk anymore, Mom, I can't." Helen's own resolve was crumbling. Her legs felt like lead. She sank onto a moss-covered fallen log, pulling Leo close to her. She held him and rocked him, murmuring apologies and reassurances she didn't feel. For a moment, she considered the unthinkable, giving up, just sitting here and waiting for whatever came next. Maybe Blackwood would find them. Maybe she could trade the satchel for her children's lives. The sheer weight of her exhaustion and despair was a physical force, pinning her down. The emeralds in the bag seemed to mock her, their immense value useless against hunger, exhaustion, and fear. She let Leo cry, his small, shuddering sobs echoing in the vast, indifferent forest. She had nothing left, no strength, no hope, no plan. Her gaze fell upon the duffel bag at her feet. Inside, beneath the clothes, was the diary, Abram's diary. The thought of his last desperate words, "God protect Sarah and my boy," was a jolt of electricity to her system. He had faced this same monster, this same suffocating fear, and he hadn't given up. He had fought back in the only way he could, by hiding the truth, by creating a time capsule of his own murder, in the desperate hope that someone, someday, would find it. She was that someone. Giving up now wouldn't just be her failure, it would be his too. It would be letting Silas and Arthur Blackwood win, letting their violence triumph over Abram's love for his family. A new strength, born not of hope, but of sheer, stubborn defiance, began to solidify within her. She would not let Abram's family be forgotten. She would not let Blackwood take anything else. She kissed the top of Leo's head. "Okay, baby. Just a little rest." She opened the duffel bag and pulled out the small, half-empty water bottle she had managed to save from the bus station. She gave the last few sips to Leo, the plastic crinkling as he drained it. The act of giving him her last resource felt like a sacrament. She wiped his tears with her thumb. "We can do this," she said, her voice stronger now. "We're going to find a nice man who is going to help us." She stood up, her muscles screaming in protest, and pulled him to his feet. She adjusted Sophie in her carrier. As she looked up, past Leo's tired face, her eyes scanned the horizon of treetops, and then she saw it. It was so faint, she almost missed it, a thin, wispy grey tendril curling up into the blue sky. Smoke, a plume of smoke, rising from a chimney, somewhere ahead. It was a sign, a signal of life in the vast emptiness. A jolt of pure, unadulterated hope shot through her, so powerful it made her dizzy. "Yeah, look, Leo," she cried, her voice breaking. "Look, we found it." The last half-mile was a blur of adrenaline-fueled determination. Helen practically dragged Leo behind her, her eyes fixed on the plume of smoke as if it were a lighthouse in a storm. They broke through a final line of dense undergrowth and stumbled into a small, sun-dappled clearing. In the center stood a small, sturdy-looking log cabin, its roof solid, its windows clean. A neat vegetable garden grew beside it, and split firewood was stacked tidily against one wall. The place radiated a sense of peace and order that was the complete antithesis of the Abram ruin. And on the front porch, sitting in a gently squeaking rocking chair, was an old man. He was stick-thin, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his white hair thin. He watched their clumsy approach, his faded blue eyes holding a startling sharpness. As they stumbled to a halt at the edge of his yard, he slowly stopped rocking. The rhythmic squeak ceased, and a profound silence fell over the clearing, a silence of waiting, of questions unasked. Terror and relief warred within her as she stared at the old man. This was it, her last hope. He looked ancient, as fragile as a dried leaf, yet there was a deep stillness about him, a sense of being rooted to this land. She took a ragged breath, the air burning her lungs. "Please," she began, the word a croak. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm staying at the old Abram place." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes at the name, recognition and a deep, ancient sadness. The fight left her, and the words tumbled out in a desperate, breathless rush. "A man came to see me today. He wanted to buy the land. He threatened my children." She paused, her voice catching on a sob. "His name was Arthur Blackwood." At the sound of that name, the old man's face, and which had been passive and watchful, hardened. The gentle wrinkles around his eyes deepened into grim lines of anger and memory. He slowly, painfully, pushed himself up from his rocking chair, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, then at Leo hiding behind her, then at the sleeping baby on her chest. He saw it all, the dirt, the exhaustion, the terror. His gravelly voice, and when it came, was surprisingly strong. "Come inside, child. Get those babies out of the sun." He held the cabin door open, a simple gesture of welcome that felt monumental. The inside of the cabin was a single room, impeccably clean and filled with the comforting smells of wood smoke, old books, and brewing coffee. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth. He gestured for her to sit at a small wooden table, and without a word, he brought her a tin cup of cool water from a pump at his sink. He then cut a thick slice of cornbread from a loaf on the counter and handed it to Leo. The boy, ravenous, devoured it. The simple acts of kindness, of water and food and shelter, were so overwhelming after the horrors of the last 24 hours that Helen had to fight back a fresh wave of tears. This stranger was showing her more humanity than she had seen in a year. As Leo sat on the floor, mesmerized by the fire and finishing his bread, Helen knew she had to take the final leap of faith. The fear of trusting the wrong person was immense, but the fear of facing Blackwood alone was greater. She took a deep breath, the clean, smoky air of the cabin calming her frantic nerves. She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out the rotting leather satchel. Its dark, moldy presence felt alien in this clean, warm room. She placed it on the table between them. The old man, who she now knew must be Elijah, looked at it, his eyes widening slightly. He recognized it. Helen's hands trembled as she unbuckled the broken latch and pulled out the small, warped diary. She pushed it across the table towards him. "I found this," she said, her voice low and steady, "under a loose floorboard, along with this." She placed the original deed beside it. I think you know whose this was." Elijah reached out a gnarled, trembling hand and touched the cover of the diary. His fingers, calloused from a lifetime of work, traced the faded, embossed letters of the name. "Abram," he whispered, the name a sigh of pure grief. "Abram Walker." He looked up at Helen, and his sharp blue eyes were filled with tears, a flood of sorrow that had been dammed up for nearly half a century. "Lord have mercy," he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. "Died after all these years." He picked up the book, holding it with a reverence usually reserved for a holy text. He didn't need to open it. He knew what it was. He ran his thumb over the warped leather cover, a silent communion with a long-lost friend. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. The weight of his unspoken history filled the small cabin, a palpable presence of loss and fear. For a long moment, he just sat there, clutching the diary to his chest, a man finally confronting the ghost he had been running from his entire life. "I knew him," Elijah finally said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He looked at Helen, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I was just a boy myself, not much older than 20. I worked odd jobs on the farms around here. Abram and his wife, Sarah, they were good people, the best this mountain ever produced." He spoke of them in the present tense, as if they were still alive in his memory. He described Abram's infectious laugh, Sarah's kindness, the way their young son would follow Abram around the property, a small, adoring shadow. "He loved this land," Elijah continued, his gaze distant, lost in the past. "He didn't own it like Blackwood owned his land. With fences and titles, he was a part of it. He understood its rhythms, its secrets. That's how he found the stones. He didn't steal them from the earth. The earth offered them to him. He was so happy. He thought he'd secured his family's future forever." Elijah's voice broke, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture one of profound, unending sorrow. The old man's composure crumbled, and the story he had held inside for a lifetime came pouring out. "That night," he began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, terrified whisper, as if Blackwood's ghost might hear him. "The night they vanished. I was walking home late from a job over on the next ridge. There was a full moon, bright as day." He described cutting through the woods and seeing the headlights of a truck parked on the track leading to Abram's place. It was Silas Blackwood's truck. He recognized the dent on the fender. He heard shouting, a man's angry yell, a woman's scream. Instinctively, he dove into the bushes at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered through the leaves, a terrified, unseen witness to a crime that the mountain would swallow. He saw it all. He saw everything. The darkness in his memory was still as vivid as if it were happening right now, in the warm, fire-lit cabin. He described the scene with a horrifying, cinematic clarity that made the hair on Helen's arms stand on end. Silas's two thugs. I knew them. Brutish men who did his dirty work. They were dragging Abram out of the house. He was fighting, but there were two of them. Sarah came running out after them, begging them to stop. One of them, he hit her, shoved her to the ground. Elijah's voice hitched, and he had to stop, squeezing his eyes shut as if to block out the image. Their little boy came out, crying for his mama. They grabbed him too. They threw them all in the back of the flatbed truck like they were sacks of feed. Abram was still fighting, screaming Sarah's name. They hit him again, with a shovel handle, I think. He went quiet after that. The old man was openly weeping now, his thin body shaking with the force of the 50-year-old memory. I watched the truck's taillights disappear down the mountain, and I never saw them again. A terrible, racking sob shook Elijah's frail frame. He buried his face in his hands, his shame a palpable force in the room. "I did nothing," he choked out, the words muffled by his palms. "I was so scared. I ran home and hid under my bed like a little child. I knew what Silas Blackwood was. He was poison. He owned this county. The sheriff was his cousin. A word from him could make a man disappear, and no one would ever ask a question. If I had spoken up, they would have come for me. They would have come for my family." He looked at Helen, his eyes swimming with the tears of a lifetime of regret. So I said nothing. I let my fear turn me into a coward, and I have lived with their ghosts every single day since. He took a ragged breath. Arthur, his son, he's the same. He has his father's smile and his father's soul, a snake in a fine suit. If he knows you have that diary and those deeds, he will not stop. He will do anything to get them back. Elijah's gaze fell upon the emeralds, which Helen had partially uncovered. He shook his head slowly. "That's the legend," he murmured. "Abram's ghost treasure. After Silas took the land, he and his men tore that place apart looking for the stones. They never found them. Silas died frustrated, knowing the real prize had slipped through his fingers. Arthur has been obsessed with it his whole life. It's not just about the money for him. It's about finishing what his father started. It's about power. That deed you hold proves his entire family fortune is built on a lie and a murder. That diary is his indictment. And those stones, they are the proof. He knows you found something, child. Your refusal to sell told him everything. He thinks you're just a helpless woman he can scare away. But he has underestimated you. And now that you've spoken to me, he will know his secret is no longer safe." The old man's words hung in the air. A death sentence. A new and immediate terror, sharper and colder than anything she had felt before, seized Helen. Elijah's story had not brought relief. It had brought confirmation. The monster was real, his history of violence was proven, and she had just led him right to the one living witness who could corroborate Abram's diary. She had endangered this kind old man who had done nothing but show her compassion. "What do we do?" she whispered, the question a plea. "He'll come for us. He'll come for you." Elijah's face, which had been contorted with the pain of the past, hardened with a grim resolve for the present. "No," he said, his voice firm. "He won't find you here. That would be too obvious. It would connect you to me. He's not stupid. He'll expect you to be back at the ruin." Terrified, cornered, like an animal in a trap, the thought of returning to that dark, rotting house made her feel physically ill. It was the last place on earth she wanted to be. "You must go back there," Elijah insisted, his words a painful necessity. "It's the only way. He'll think you're alone, that you have nowhere to go. It's the last place he'll expect you to be if you're planning something. You must hide. Hide better than Abram did." He stood up and went to a small table in the corner, where a dusty, black rotary phone sat. "This old thing barely works. Sometimes I get a line out. Sometimes I don't. But I will try. I will keep trying until I get through. My nephew, his name is David. He's a prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney in Charlotte. He's a good man, a powerful one. He's the only one who can bring the thunder down on Arthur Blackwood." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. "You just have to stay alive until I can reach him. Go now. Hide the satchel, and pray, child. Pray he doesn't come tonight." The walk back to the ruin was a journey through the 9 circles of hell. Every shadow was a henchman. Every snapping twig was the cocking of a gun. The forest, which had been indifferent on the way there, now felt actively hostile, its darkness filled with a malevolent intelligence. Helen clutched the duffel bag to her chest, the weight of the satchel inside a constant, terrifying reminder of her new reality. Leo, sensing the change in her, the new, sharp edge of her fear, walked in silence, his small hand gripping hers. She reached the clearing as the last light of day was draining from the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. The ruin stood waiting for her, a black, skeletal silhouette against the dying light. It looked more like a crypt than ever before. Elijah's words echoed in her mind, "Stay alive until I can reach him." She was walking back into her own tomb, armed with nothing but a desperate hope that an old man's broken-down telephone would work. Once inside, the darkness was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed all light and muffled all sound. Helen's first instinct was to hide the satchel under the floorboard again. But she knew they would look there. Abram's hiding place was compromised. Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, found the crumbling stone chimney in the corner of the room. Part of the flue had collapsed, leaving a dark, soot-filled opening. It was perfect. She reached deep inside the chimney, the cold, gritty soot covering her arm, and shoved the satchel as far up the flue as she could. It was filthy, but it was secure. Then she gathered her children. She found the most defensible corner of the room, a small alcove partially protected by a large, fallen section of the second floor. She pulled debris in front of it, creating a small, hidden nest. There, in the cold and the dark, she huddled with her children, her body rigid, every nerve ending screaming, and she began to wait. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Silence, which she had once craved, was now her enemy. It stretched and warped, allowing her imagination to fill it with horrors. The house settled with a groan, and she flinched, her heart stopping. The wind moaned through a crack, and she heard a man's voice. Leo had fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep, his head in her lap. Sophie slept in her carrier, a warm, innocent weight against her chest. Helen did not sleep. She could not. She was a statue of pure, vigilant terror, her ears straining, listening for the one sound she knew was coming. She was a mouse in a maze, and the cat was on its way. She clutched her children, her only warmth in the profound, bone-deep cold of the ruin. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the darkness, the cold, the waiting, and the ever-growing certainty that they were coming for her. And then it came. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration felt through the floorboards, a deep thrum that was not of the forest. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine, laboring up the steep, muddy track. It was not the purr of Blackwood's sedan. This was the guttural roar of a powerful truck. Helen's blood ran cold. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, silent gasp. "They are here." The 4 words from the diary became her reality, a prophecy fulfilled. The sound grew louder, closer, a monstrous, mechanical beast clawing its way through the darkness, its sole purpose to find her. She hugged her children tighter, burying her face in Leo's hair, trying to muffle the sound of her own frantic, terrified heartbeat. The truck was in the clearing now. She could hear the crunch of its tires on the gravel and debris. The predator had arrived. The truck's headlights flared to life, 2 brilliant white beams that sliced through the broken windows of the ruin. They swept across the room, illuminating the mold, the decay, and the dust motes dancing in the air like frantic spirits. The light created monstrous, elongated shadows that writhed and danced on the walls. For a moment, one of the beams passed directly over their hiding spot, and Helen squeezed her eyes shut, convinced they had been seen. Then the lights went out. The engine was cut. A sudden, shocking silence descended, more terrifying than the noise had been. It was an absolute void, punctuated only by the frantic chirping of crickets and the roaring of blood in Helen's ears. 2 heavy truck doors slammed shut, the sound like twin gunshots in the night. They were out. They were here. Low, rough voices drifted through the night air, muffled but clear enough for Helen's hyper-attuned ears to decipher. "You sure he said she'd be here?" one voice grumbled. Place is a dump. A second voice, colder and more confident, replied. Boss said she's here. Said she'd talk to the old man. He's getting impatient. A cold dread washed over Helen. Elijah. They knew. They knew she had spoken to him. The second voice continued, its words chilling Helen to the bone. Our orders are simple. Find the bag, the one with the rocks and the papers. Scare her good until she hands it over. Boss said not to come back without it. The bag. They knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't a random intimidation. It was a targeted extraction. The men were coming inside. There was no more time. A heavy boot slammed against the front door. The impact shuddered through the entire structure, and a shower of plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. Crack. The sound of splintering wood was explosively loud. Another violent kick, and the already fragile door burst from its single hinge, crashing against the interior wall. Heavy, crunching footsteps entered the main room. Well, what do we have here? One of the men drawled. Beams from powerful flashlights cut through the darkness, their cones of light sweeping methodically across the floor, the walls, the debris. Come on out, little lady, the other man called, his voice a mocking, sing-song taunt. We just want to talk about some property. Mr. Blackwood is very interested in what you found. The flashlight beams moved closer and closer to their hiding spot. Helen knew they had seconds, maybe less, before the light would fall on them. The time for hiding was over. The time for running had come. In that split second, a clarity born of pure adrenaline cut through her fear. The men were in the main room, moving towards the fireplace with their backs to the rear wall of the house. Now or never. She moved with a silent, explosive speed she didn't know she possessed. She shook Leo awake. Her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle his cry of surprise. Shh, baby, we have to go. Now, she breathed into his ear. She had the duffel bag with the water and bread, but the satchel, the proof, the treasure, was in the chimney. A wave of panic. She couldn't leave it. But as one of the flashlight beams swung perilously close, she knew she had no choice. Her children's lives were more important than emeralds. She scooped the terrified, half-asleep boy into her arms. With Sophie strapped to her chest and Leo under one arm, she scrambled on all fours towards the back of the house, towards the dark, gaping hole of a broken window. Hey, what was that? One of the men shouted, his flashlight beam swinging wildly in her direction. It was too late. Helen didn't hesitate. She shoved a whimpering Leo through the low, broken window frame, ignoring the scrape of broken glass on his jacket. She tumbled out right after him, landing hard on the cold, damp earth outside. The fall knocked the wind out of her, but the sounds of the men shouting and crashing through the house behind her were a powerful motivator. Get up, she hissed, pulling Leo to his feet. He was crying, disoriented and terrified. Run, Leo, run to the trees. Don't stop and don't look back. She grabbed his hand, and they plunged headlong into the absolute, terrifying darkness of the Appalachian forest. The men's angry shouts pursued them, but they were already being swallowed by the night. Two small children and their mother, armed with nothing but a desperate will to live, fleeing into the heart of the wild. They crashed through the undergrowth into the small clearing around Elijah's cabin, a whirlwind of sobbing terror. Helen's lungs burned. Her legs were latticed with bloody scratches from thorns, and Leo was hysterical. Elijah threw open his door, his face a grim mask of pure urgency. They're coming, Helen gasped, collapsing against the solid doorframe. No, Elijah said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her panic. He pointed a gnarled finger at the ancient black rotary phone on his wall. They're already here. He had gotten through. While she had been cowering in the dark, he had been fighting their war. His nephew, David, the assistant U.S. attorney, was on his way. He had mobilized the FBI from Charlotte. They were not to engage, just to get to Elijah's house and wait for them. The distant shouts of the henchmen faded, swallowed by the immense, protective silence of the mountains. Inside the small cabin, the warm air smelled of wood smoke and hope, a true fortress against the night she had just barely escaped from. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, headlights cut through the darkness. But these were different. They moved with a quiet, coordinated purpose, a pair of dark, unmarked sedans that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. They parked without a sound, and several men in dark suits emerged, moving with a fluid, professional grace. One of them, younger than the others, with sharp eyes and a weary but determined face, approached the cabin. "Uncle Elijah," he called out. Elijah opened the door and embraced him. "David." Thank God! This was the authority Helen had dreamed of, not the compromised local sheriff, but something clean, powerful, and incorruptible. David's eyes found Helen huddled with her children by the fire. He saw her torn clothes, the terror still etched on her face, and his expression hardened. He wasn't just a prosecutor, he was Elijah's blood. This was now deeply personal for him too. He nodded at her, a gesture of profound reassurance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm. "You're safe now. Let's hear the story." Her voice was a ragged whisper at first, but it gained strength as she recounted the tale, the words tumbling out. She spoke of the ad, the ruin, the discovery under the floor. She described Abram's diary, Arthur Blackwood's visit, his chilling threats. Then came the moment of panic. "The satchel," she choked out, her heart sinking. "The diary, the stones. I had to leave it. I hid it in the chimney and ran." For a terrifying second she thought all was lost, that her proof was gone, but David just nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Your testimony is enough to start," he said calmly. Then he turned to his uncle. Elijah, his voice trembling but clear, told the story he had held in for nearly 50 years. He spoke of the night he watched Silas Blackwood's men drag Abram, Sarah, and their boy into a truck. He was no longer a coward hiding from a ghost. He was an eyewitness delivering a final damning testament. The two stories, a half-century apart, intertwined into a single, undeniable truth right there in the fire-lit cabin. The FBI operation was a model of swift, silent efficiency. Before dawn, they had secured the Abram property, turning the ruin into an officially sealed federal crime scene. Two agents, guided by Helen's description, went directly to the crumbling chimney. A moment later, one emerged, his hands covered in black soot, carefully carrying the rotting leather satchel as if it were a holy relic. Inside a mobile command unit that now hummed with quiet power in the clearing, they carefully emptied its contents onto a sterile white cloth. The yellowed deed, the warped diary, and the pile of rough, uncut emeralds gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. The physical evidence was finally safe, catalogued under the unblinking eye of federal law. A wave of relief so profound it felt like exhaustion washed over Helen. The weight she had been carrying, the terrible secret that had felt like a physical burden, was finally lifted from her shoulders. She had done it. She had delivered Abram's message to the world. The convoy of dark sedans rolled up the pristine, tree-lined driveway of the Blackwood estate just as the sun was rising. The grand white mansion, a symbol of untouchable power, looked serene in the morning light. Arthur Blackwood was likely still asleep, dreaming of his impending victory. The federal agents swarmed the entrance. There was no polite knock. They announced their presence with a warrant, their voices echoing in the marble-floored foyer. Arthur appeared at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in a silk robe, a condescending smirk already forming on his face. But the smirk froze and then vanished as he saw not the local sheriff, but a phalanx of stern-faced FBI agents, and standing behind them, his face a mask of cold justice, was David. The connection, the trap, snapped shut in his mind. His face, usually so composed, contorted with a flash of pure, impotent rage as they snapped the cold steel of handcuffs onto his wrists. His reign, built on his father's violence and secrets, was over. The arrest of Arthur Blackwood sent shockwaves through the state. The case became a media sensation, a dark Appalachian Gothic tale of greed, murder, and justice delayed. The full weight of the U.S. Attorney's Office descended, armed with Abram's diary, Elijah's testimony, and decades of financial records that unraveled the Blackwood family's web of fraud and intimidation. The indictments were extensive: racketeering, land fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy charges related to the forced disappearance of the Walker family. In court, Abram's original deed, authenticated by experts, was held up as the one true claim to the land. The court voided the fraudulent title held by the Blackwood estate and, in a landmark ruling, affirmed Helen's purchase. The $500 she had spent in desperation had, through a chain of impossible events, made her the rightful legal owner of Abram Walker's land. The victory was not just hers, It was a final, resounding victory for the ghosts of the mountain. Then came the matter of the emeralds. Appraised by experts under federal supervision, the rough stones were determined to be a rare, high-quality vein with a value that was staggering. The numbers whispered in the courtroom were so astronomical they sounded like fiction. With Abram's immediate family declared victims of a historical crime and no other known heirs, the court had to decide the fate of the fortune. Citing Helen's role as the discoverer of both the treasure and the evidence that solved a decades-old capital crime, a judge awarded her legal title to a large portion of the emerald's value. She heard the final sum in a lawyer's quiet office, a number with so many zeros it seemed to lose all meaning. Her mind flashed back to the moment she had checked her bank account in the dim light of the bus station. $500. A wave of nausea, this time born not of fear, but of pure, vertiginous shock, washed over her. Her life, and her children's lives, were no longer just safe. They were utterly and irrevocably transformed. 6 months later, the sound of a hammer hitting a nail echoed in the clearing, a rhythmic, life-affirming beat that had replaced the sound of dripping water and decay. The ruin was gone, its rotten timbers carefully removed. In its place, a beautiful modern farmhouse was rising, its clean lines and wide windows designed to let the sun in, not keep the world out. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine and wet paint, the scent of a new beginning. In the sprawling green yard, Leo's laughter, loud and carefree, filled the air as he chased a bright red ball. On the wide, warm porch, a squealing Sophie took her first wobbly steps into her mother's waiting arms. The crushing silence of the wilderness had been replaced by the sounds of a family finally at home, their joy a stark, beautiful contrast to the desperation that had first brought them to this very spot. The land, once a tombstone, was now a cradle, nurturing a new life that had been born from the ashes of an old one. Helen sat in a sun-drenched room, the gentle hum of a brand-new Marne top-of-the-line sewing machine, a soothing melody. Her hands, once trembling with fear and cold, now moved with a confident, joyful purpose across a swath of deep blue silk. She was not mending rags or selling her tools to survive. She was creating beauty for its own sake. She glanced out the large picture window, watching her children play safely in their own yard, a scene so peaceful it felt like a dream. The deep ache in her heart, the constant companion of her grief and poverty, was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace and security. A single tear slid down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of gratitude. The aroma of a roasting chicken drifted from the kitchen, a promise of a full meal, of a pantry that would never be empty again. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become a guardian, a protector of both her own family and the memory of the one that had been lost. That evening, they sat around a solid oak dining table, the warm glow of the lights reflecting in their happy faces. The food was plentiful, the house was secure, and the future was a vast, open horizon of possibility. On the mantelpiece above the new stone fireplace, a small, simple frame held a carefully preserved page from Abram's diary, his neat cursive a reminder of the life that had made their own possible. Helen had not just found a fortune, she had inherited a legacy of resilience and delivered a justice that had been denied for a generation. Her journey had taken her to the absolute bottom, into a ruin of despair, but in its darkness, she found the strength to fight for the light, for her children, and for the silent ghosts of the past. Helen's story is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest ruins, seeds of justice can grow. If you were moved by her journey from desperation to redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell, so you never miss a story of hope found in the most unexpected of places.